Okay, this is week 6, and our topic for this week is leadership. If you recall, it's one of the key tasks, as your book describes it, of management. And so we're very interested in covering the topic. I'm going to cover it from a couple of perspectives. I'm going to introduce some new material that sort of challenges the idea that leadership and management are actually different, very different skill sets. Your book takes the position that leadership is a subset of effective management. I don't know that it matters which side you choose to align with. The concepts in essence are the same, but I do want to present some arguments because you may run into situations in your career where someone offers the opinion that leadership and management are quite different. And this will give you a sort of a toolbox for responding to that kind of statement. So at the conclusion of this week, I want you to be able to explain the relationship between power and leadership. We've talked about power a good bit in this class, and we'll continue to do so this time. I want you to explain the various contingency models of leadership, and there are several that we will cover in the second part of our weekly videos. I want you to include the work of Goleman, which is not included in your text. And I also want you to be able to evaluate the behavior of a leader and use that to illustrate your understanding of the contingency models. So that's what we're going to be doing this week in a 2-part coverage of the material. Okay, first let's define leadership. So the nature of leadership as defined in your book is the process by which a person exerts influence over other people and inspires, motivates, directs their activities to help achieve group or organizational goals. And the key words here that will come back over and over again are exerts influence, inspires, and motivates. So we've spent some time talking about motivation and what can lead a person to be motivated. And so I will reference that material as we go along. Okay, let's start with an exercise. Let me pose this question to you. Define the ideal leader in your mind. In essence, complete the sentence, an ideal leader is someone who, and then explain what you mean by that. Jot down a few things while you're thinking about it, and then I'll resume in just a second. Okay, if we were in class, I would then ask each of you to offer up what your thoughts were, and I would keep a list on the board. And you might notice after a while that my list would look something like this. This is the kind of thing that I would expect many of you to offer. It is often the case that when people talk about an ideal leader, they say it's someone who's honest, a person of integrity, can define a vision, is approachable, can make good decisions, is concerned about his or her employees, can inspire others, and the list goes on. We could generate a list of 10 or 20 things. I do hope you notice, though, that I've created this as I would in class as 2 columns. And again, you would be the ones offering up these answers, but I'm still putting them in these 2 columns. And I think you can probably look at it and figure out why I have put them in the columns that way. And it's because the left column is what they are. In essence, the kind of person the leader is. It's about their personality, their ethics, their values, and character. On the right side, it's about what that leader does. They define a vision, they can make decisions, they can inspire other people. Now, if you look at this idea of what a leader is, what a leader knows, which is not up there, and what a leader does, that is a common way of framing the idea of leadership, particularly in the military, and it's a very effective way, I think, to think about leadership. So if we look at it then, at what kind of person this is, again, that's character, personality, and ethics. What they know would be knowledge of the job, understanding of people, understanding of themselves, I'd like to point out to you that we've already talked about personality and ethics in the class. And when we talked about emotional intelligence, we were talking about having an understanding of yourself and other people, and understanding their emotions and how they would react to things. And then there's what they do. And for purposes of the conversation today, we're going to talk primarily about how they lead. And when we get into the discussion of leadership theories in the second part of this week's discussion, it will focus on how leaders lead. So we can define leadership in terms of who someone is, what they know, and what they do. And then the question comes up, does leadership differ from management? Let's look at the idea of management as distinctly different from leadership. Some people, some researchers, and certainly some practicing executives believe that there is a distinct difference between management and leadership. Others believe that it's really all part of one bundle of capabilities. But let's explore the difference for a bit and see if you find this information interesting. It's not in your book, but as I've mentioned earlier, it is the case that some people believe there is a distinction, and this will give you a little bit of a toolbox for discussing the difference between the two. Management, under this model, is about coping with complexity. And in contrast, the authors of this study argue, leadership is about coping with change. So, what does that mean then? It would mean that really good management is about bringing a degree of order to organizations, organizing, budgeting, prioritizing, coordinating, communicating, planning, and controlling, whereas highly effective leadership involves setting a vision, motivating, and inspiring. Now, some of us know, I'm sure, really good managers, people who are very, very effective at management, using this description of effective management. They know how to structure an uncertain situation. They can put together a plan and a schedule and budgets, and they can coordinate and communicate about what needs to happen next, and they can ensure that there is progress made. A perfect example of that would be a complex project of some type, a large construction project, a large research and development project, a large engineering project. And there are some people who are very good at creating order out of complexity and chaos that would be a project like that if left to its own devices. Leadership, on the other hand, is about setting a big inspirational vision and then motivating other people to follow. I think we would all agree we know people who are effective managers that are not effective leaders, and we may know people who are highly effective leaders that are not effective managers using this definition. So what would that mean? Well, if you were king or queen for a day running an organization, you would probably love to have both sets of capabilities, to be a great manager and a great leader. You would also want to ensure that your organization has great management and great leadership as part of the structure of the organization. But you may or may not find that in one individual. And so the real task of someone in charge of an organization is to figure out what individuals are able to do. Or some people are much better at addressing the big picture visioning leadership aspect of what goes on in an organization, maybe turning around a sales organization, moving into a new market so that you meet new customers, you persuade them to buy the products that you have, to work with you on new product development initiatives and sort of build the future of both organizations. Or do you have issues in your organization that are associated with trying to become more efficient, streamline complexity, adhere to budgets, and manage more professionally? Well, most organizations have both of those issues, and the key would be how do you align people in order to have them be best at what they do. It's unfair to take someone who is extraordinarily talented in management but not talented in leadership and expect them to lead change. It's not part of their capability. It's probably not part of their interest. By the same token, it's not fair to take someone who is highly effective as a leader of change and put them in a bureaucratic situation that needs to be structured, where it's all about the nuts and bolts and figuring out the details and tracking processes and becoming more effective and efficient within the organization. That is not something that they would be well suited to. Some people, as I say, are able to do both, and they may even thrive in an environment where they have an opportunity to do both. But just be mindful of this distinction, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it on the next slide. So on this slide, what we see is the left column has a series of activities, and that left column is in essence trying to create buckets of activities that managers and leaders are supposed to address. Those are the issues they address. The first activity there is referred to as creating an agenda. Creating an agenda is sort of a combination of creating plans, but also setting direction. It's deciding what we're going to do and how to do it. The second bucket of activity is developing the human network. That's identifying the people and getting all of the people involved that are part of this effort. And then executing on whatever plans have been developed, and then understanding what the outcomes should be. Now, according to these same researchers who are drawing this distinction, a manager approaches this process of agenda setting as a planning and budgeting activity. So what is our plan? We need to identify specific targets, we need to, and goals and objectives, we need to derive from those goals and objectives the particular action plans that must be implemented in order to focus our efforts going forward. And then what are the financial resources needed at each point and each unit in order to make that happen. Now, the authors of this study, though, would argue that leaders approach that agenda creation a little differently. They approach it as establishing direction. It's sort of like, where are we going and why are we going there? And that's the difference between kind of a management approach to creating an agenda and a leadership approach. In terms of that second bucket of activities, developing the human network, for management, it's about recruitment and organizing and deciding what the staff capabilities need to be within each unit. If you're going to do work, then you want the right people in the right place to do that. And so organizing the work and then staffing it with the right people are what are part or the task of putting the people resources in place. The leadership view of that, which again it tends to be a little bit less detail oriented, is more about aligning people. It's getting them to all believe in a common outcome, believe in a common way of working. And so you're aligning them, but you're not so much organizing them. Now again, you can look at this and decide if you agree or not. You can decide if you believe you fall into one of these buckets or the other. I would argue the most effective people of all are the ones who can see both of these columns of activities and do both. That is hard to do. The third bucket of activities is executing plans. And so from a management perspective, that is controlling and problem solving. So it is pacing activity with targets and milestones that become your control elements, and then figuring out if you're not meeting schedule, why not? If you're not meeting budget, why not? If you're not meeting goal, why not? And fixing that problem. From a leadership perspective, it's more about motivating and inspiring. It's a little bit like saying, okay, to execute this plan, you people go do it. Just go do it. And they motivate and inspire, but they're not going to get into the detailed planning of it, or they may try to just do it themselves. Some leaders, Steve Jobs comes to mind, sort of get down in the details and try to do it all themselves until somebody pulls it away from them and tries to do it themselves. But they are more interested in sort of selling these ideas and what needs to happen than they are in structuring the work so others can follow a process and do it. And then in terms of outcomes, of course, managers tend to produce a degree of predictability and order. They structure a process that can be replicated over time. They deliver on major results expected of stakeholders. Whereas leadership is producing change. Leadership is about entering new markets. Leadership is about launching a new venture altogether. Leadership may be about launching a wholly new technology, but it's about bringing about fundamental change. Okay, continuing this a little bit more with some of the research of these authors, managers and leaders differ in terms of the goals that they set. Now, just bear with me while I talk about this. The argument these researchers make is that managers tend to set goals that are the goals that are needed for the organization to be successful. They're the goals that are influenced by the circumstances in the organization's environment. So, for example, if what you find is that the profit is not as high as it was last year, then the goal will be, based on the fact that our profit is not what it needs to be and we need for our profit to be improved, we need to initiate goals to reduce our cost structure. We need to initiate goals to shift our product mix so that we're commanding a slightly higher price premium per product. And if we're able to command a higher price and we're able to reduce our cost, then profits will increase. So managers approach it impersonally. It's not so much about their own personal desire and what they want to see happen. It's what the organization needs to see happen, and it is in response to the evidence that is there. Leaders, on the other hand, tend to think in terms of goals that are more personal. It's what they personally care about, what they want to see happen, and they tend to evoke images when they talk about it. So, and they tend to be outward focused, meaning they are looking at the environment. It's not so much as the company having any specific issues it needs to address. It's sort of, how are we going to change the world? How can we be the best? How can we dominate this market sector? How can we achieve highest market share? So the goals tend to be like that. They sometimes are more competitive. Sometimes they're more social oriented in their outcome. It depends on the passions of that leader, less so about the evidence provided within the organization about what might need to happen. So again, both of these perspectives are excellent. We're not claiming leaders are better than managers. We're not claiming managers are better than leaders. We're claiming that these really are two different sets of behaviors that you can see that we then describe as leadership behaviors and management behaviors when we're talking about goal setting. Okay, how do they organize work? Well, managers tend to be able to organize people in processes. They sort of negotiate, they bargain, they assign people to do particular work, they reward them for that work. They try to streamline the nature of the processes that are being done, and they try to herd everyone toward a solution, toward a common set of outcomes that the organization desires. Leaders, these people with this sort of more of a leadership propensity, tend to be really impatient with routines and procedures. So they project ideas and they develop new approaches, but they won't get into sort of the more abstract details of organizing the day-to-day work processes. So they're impatient with those routines and procedures. And in terms of the sense of self, how do they differ? Well, managers are very at home in their environment. They tend to be viewed, as we said, they're someone who creates order out of chaos. So and complexity. They're regulators of an existing order. They have a sense of duty and responsibility. They feel like this belongs to them and it's their responsibility to take care of it. And they're very at home in that environment. They often really enjoy being around people. They enjoy being part of an organization and working with people. Leaders, on the other hand, some research has shown people who have more of a leadership propensity tend to be a little separate from everybody else. They never really belong to the group. Their sense of self is separate from social interaction. So they can have social interactions. Again, they're interacting with people in order to inspire them and motivate them and all of those things, but they're not really part of the group. They are different from the group. There's a lot of research that suggests that that's an attribute of leaders. And somebody might argue, I think I would, that in order to be able to strike out and move in a different direction, to take some risk in the face of uncertainty, to to be willing to be wrong a lot, which a leader in some ways is, right? They're sort of out front. Then in some ways they have to be less concerned about what others think about them. Maybe more interested sort of in what they want to see happen rather than what others think of them. They're willing to lose face, possibly. So, what would be our conclusion about this? Based on what those researchers have looked at, I guess I would ask you, are these differences a matter of behavior, meaning it's what people are doing, or is it a matter of personality? Is it who they are? So remember when we talked about leadership, we said what they are, who they are, what they know, and what they do. And so based on what we've just talked about, is that what people do that's different, leadership behaviors versus management behaviors? Or is that a function of personality, and somebody's personality leads them to employ these leadership abilities more so than management abilities, and vice versa? Somebody's more by personality aligned with the management behaviors than with the leadership behaviors. It's an interesting question. And it leads to the idea of, can leadership be taught? Because what have we said? We've said behavior can be changed. Personality, for the most part, cannot. So if most of those differences are related to personality, then that would make it difficult to teach leadership and management to people who had a propensity to move in one or the other direction. But I guess we would all argue that everyone can be taught to be a more effective leader. So you can, through education and experience, learn to be better than you are at any given point in time. Learn to be better as a manager, learn to be better as a leader compared to what you have done in the past. So there are many, many different perspectives on leadership and what leadership involves, as I've mentioned. Let's turn our attention now to the topic of power and influence. I had mentioned we would come back to this topic this week as we discuss leadership. So let's talk about it for a minute. Your book does an excellent job of covering the power and influence literature and talking about different sources of power. And I do want to touch on those to show you, to illustrate to you that I think they're important and make sure you're well positioned for them in terms of any assignments that are due this week. I want to revisit the point that power and influence tend to have a bad connotation in many democracies, because as we use the term power today, we associate it with coercion or force, and that's unfortunate because that's not the history of the term. It is more closely associated with the idea of influence, and we will talk about that as we move through the next few slides. I would argue that while we will visit the idea of the sources of power and influence, in essence, the way that someone acts when they have a source of power is they can choose to direct others to do what they want them to do. They can choose to persuade others, or they can choose to negotiate or bargain with them. So let's think about how those differ. So direct means it's a one-way thing. It's sort of, if I'm going to direct you to do something, then I just tell you to do it, and you're expected to do it. And there's certain organizations where you can do that. And somebody with a position of authority, your boss, can, for the most part, direct you to do things. But there are other forms of power and influence that are exerted in organizations that are not directly tied to, a boss directing a subordinate to do something, which is, not that common in organizations anyway these days. Another way might be to negotiate or bargain. And in essence, negotiating or bargaining would mean if you'll do this, then you get this in return. Or if you redo this work, then you can go home early. If you do a really, really good job on this, then I can assure you a day off. Or if you do a really good job on this entire project, there'll be a raise coming at the end of it. So it's in essence a two-way negotiation. You're offering up what you want them to do, and you have the power to make that offer and to then follow through with something that might be part of a bargain that would be struck from that. But both people are involved in it. And another is just persuasion. And persuasion is making the case for why this is the appropriate course of action given the nature of the work that needs to be accomplished. And certainly with most people in professional occupations, that's what you would expect. You don't expect to have to bargain. You don't expect to have to direct. You just expect to have to explain and make the case for why change is needed or why some particular task is needed. The sources of power in organizations are quite interesting. Some of these are associated with the position that someone holds in an organization. So if I have a position of authority, then I have legitimate power in that organization. I have been assigned by the organization to hold that responsibility and authority, and with it comes the power to make decisions, to allocate resources, possibly to hire people, fire people, and that is legitimate authority. Well, it also can be the case that you can use that legitimate authority to provide rewards or to be coercive, to make threats and discipline or punish. But it is the case that in some organizations, other people have that authority. So even though your direct boss might have legitimate authority over you, it may be somebody else who exercises some degree of coercive authority over you, meaning they're the ones who would ultimately decide whether you lose your job or not, or they ultimately decide whether you are given a raise or not. Let's go through each one of these. So, as I said, legitimate authority is really positional authority. It's associated with the position. You have authority by virtue of the position. And what comes with that position is what the organization decides will come with it as part of their job design and organization structuring activity. So it could be that you have budget authority, and you have schedule authority, and it could be you have some autonomy to set the goals of the organization and to hire the people that you want to, and all of that is an example of legitimate power and the ability to influence what happens in the organization because of it. Another category of power, a source of power, is the ability of a manager to give or withhold tangible and intangible rewards. Well, now what does that mean? Well, certainly if you're talking about within your own unit, you have the ability to give raises or not, to give bonuses or not, to give people days off or not, to give them preferred projects or not, and that is a form of reward power that you can exert over the people who work for you, to recognize those who are high performers and to maybe, have those who are not such high performers questioning what they need to do to get some of those rewards. That could be part of positional power, right? But it could also be something separate from that. It could be that reward power is something that you think of that is actually outside the organization, that is tied to a customer or supplier. So if, for example, your company here in Huntsville, it works with government agencies, and those agencies are awarding grants and contracts, then they exert reward power over you and your organization, right? Because they have the ability to give or withhold tangible and intangible rewards. It's a form of power that they exert. Okay, if we go to the next category of power or source of power, it's coercive power, the ability of a manager to punish others. That would be sort of the negative side of power. And coercive power can be something that's part of the formal organization. It can also be part of the informal culture of an organization. So if we're talking about true power and authority as institutionalized by the organization, then a manager certainly has authority over those who work for him or her to punish, to discipline if someone is is doing something wrong. I will give an example. Again, I give a lot of examples from hotels because I have a family member who is a hotel manager. And that is an example of someone who works in a bar who was told there was a problem with the air conditioning, and he was taking the air conditioning down too low adjacent to an outdoor bar. And of course, with the heat and humidity, what it is, it was causing the air conditioning and the temperature he was setting it on, it was causing it to freeze up, and then it would leak. And it's a rooftop bar that he's managing, and they told him, what to set it on, that he was creating the problem with it freezing, and they told him to change it to a particular setting, and when to turn it off and when he could turn it on in order to make sure he didn't have that problem again. Well, what he did is he tried to figure out a way to rig it, and he put in some piping, he put in some patched with electrical tape, and which was not even the right source of tape to use. It ended up creating such a problem, such a bad leak, that it leaked through the ceiling of the guest room below that. While there was a guest there, there were all sorts of issues with it. And so then the question comes up, what is the manager going to do to address that situation? Well, since that particular employee had been told very specifically not to do anything other than a specific set of activities associated with this, he was deciding he knew more about it and sneaking this solution, and they could have fired him. But what they did instead was they presented him with the bill, and they said, the next time you think you're able to figure these things out yourself, and are going to try something again, look at this bill, and if you do something like this again, it's going to be docked from your pay. So it was a threat. It was not an action, but there had to be some sort of punishment, which in this particular case was a very serious scolding, so to speak, in order to bring about a change in his behavior, because it was really arrogant of him to think that he could just defy what the maintenance director and the hotel manager had told him and do his own thing with it. He created a huge expense and a guest that had to be moved out of a room. I mean, it was a really bad thing. And that's what coercive power is about. Many of us may work in organizations where we just don't ever see anyone use coercive power because it just doesn't come up. But that's an example of coercive power. There's also expert power, power that is based on special knowledge, skills, and expertise that a leader possesses. So it could be that they don't hold position authority. It could be that they are a senior engineer or a senior marketer or a senior designer. And they have such specialized knowledge, skills, and expertise that even though they're not in a position of authority, they are sought out for their knowledge. So they're able to exert power and influence because of their expertise. That's a wonderful situation. If you have a lot of people who are that bright and that knowledgeable, and others look to them for decisions and direction, and they are able to offer it because of their expertise. And the last source of power is what's called referent power. This is power that comes from subordinates and coworkers who just have respect for a particular leader, the personal characteristics of the leader, and as a consequence, they are loyal and they admire that leader, which gives that leader the ability to influence them. So they'll do things because they like this individual. They do things because they admire that individual. Well, in theory, you would love to think that all of your people who hold positions of authority would hold expert and referent power in their capacity as an official leader within the organization. But that's not always the case. And sometimes what you see is that referent power and expert power resides with individuals that are part of the organization. And so that again lets you understand how organizations work. It lets you understand also how the culture of an organization could evolve around some of the people with expert and referent power over time. So that concludes our discussion for the first part of leadership, and I will come back with the second part next. just to revisit the learning objectives for this week, I would want you to be able to explain the relationship between power and leadership, and certainly we have discussed that already. When we come back, we're going to talk about contingency models of leadership, which is more about what leaders do. It's leadership behavior, leadership styles.